Ready to dive into some probability today?
Yes, sounds good.
We're taking a look at this high school math textbook.
Yeah.
And it's all about probability.
Okay.
And it's all about probability. But don't worry, we're not going back to school or anything.
Yeah, no pop quizzes or anything like that.
No, none of that. But, it's really interesting, though, because when you think about probability, it actually underpins so much of our everyday lives.
It really does.
Yeah.
When you check that weather forecast, or maybe you're thinking about investments, it's all there.
It really is. It's everywhere. And speaking of high-stakes decisions,
Okay.
did you know that probability, like the very foundations of it,
Yeah.
were actually laid by a gambler?
Really? A gambler, huh?
Yeah, way back in the 17th century.
Wow.
This guy, Chevalier Emery,
Yeah.
he was trying to improve his odds in a dice game,
Okay.
and he, basically sparked a mathematical revolution.
Wow. Talk about a high-stakes roll of the dice.
I know, right? And so our textbook here, it explains how de Marais actually reached out to Blaise Pascal for help. You know the Pascal.
Oh, yeah.
And Pascal, he was like, okay, this is interesting. So he collaborated with Pierre de Fermat
Wow.
to try to kind of crack the code of chance.
So, from this gambler's question, we got probability theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's now used in, you think about it, it's meteorology, finance, AI.
It's amazing how far it's come.
It really is. And speaking of diverse applications, our source material, it actually gives us some really interesting examples of how probability is used in the real world. We're going to get into those in a little bit.
Okay.
But first, let's break down the fundamental building blocks of probability.
Yeah, let's get back to basics for a minute. One of the key concepts is empirical probability. Basically, figuring out how likely something is to happen based on what we actually see happening in the real world.
So, think flipping a coin or rolling dice.
Yeah, exactly. Those are the classic examples. You're trying to figure out how often something happens, like getting heads within a certain number of tries.
Okay, so, if you flip a coin 100 times and you land heads, say, 52 times,
Yeah.
you could say the probability of getting heads is roughly 52%.
Precisely. You got it. And the cool thing is this same principle, using what we observe to calculate probabilities, it applies to way more complex scenarios, too.
Right. It reminds me of how they make weather forecasts, right?
Yeah.
They're not just, pulling a 30% chance of rain out of thin air.
No, definitely not.
They're using tons of data about past weather patterns and what's happening in the atmosphere right now.
Exactly. They analyze all that data and look for trends. That's how meteorologists use probability to predict the weather.
So we've gone from, gamblers in the 17th century to predicting the weather, and it all comes back to probability.
It's pretty amazing, right, how one concept can have such a huge impact.
It really is. And speaking of real-world applications,
Yeah.
the textbook, it mentions how tire manufacturers use probability, and this is really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. It's a great example. Because it's not just some theoretical thing, right? This is about safety. It's about our money.
Yeah, no, totally. So how does it work? Tell me more.
Okay, so basically, tire companies, they collect huge amounts of data. I mean, mountains of it. Think tread wear, driving conditions, how long tires usually last, all of that.
Okay.
And they use all of that to figure out the chances of a tire failing.
So at different points in its lifespan.
Exactly. So when they tell you to replace your tires after a certain number of miles, it's not just a random guess.
Right. There's actually data behind that recommendation.
Data is key. And, this whole approach, it not only helps manufacturers make better recommendations, but it also helps us, the consumers, make better decisions about, when to replace our tires.
So it's a win-win. And I'm guessing the more data points they have,
Oh, yeah.
the more accurate those predictions become.
Exactly. And our textbook, it points out that this applies to a lot of areas, like even analyzing student test scores.
Oh, interesting. So how does that work?
Well, educators can use probability to see how those scores are distributed. They can spot any outliers, students who are way above or below average. And they can even get a sense of how students might perform on future tests based on how they've done in the past.
So once again, it's about seeing those patterns in the data and using that to try to predict the future.
You got it. And one of the most powerful examples of this, it has to be how insurance companies use probability.
Okay, yeah. Because insurance, that feels like a whole other level.
Yeah.
How does probability fit into something as complex as insurance?
Well, you have to remember that insurance companies, their whole business is assessing and managing risk.
Right.
And probability is their most powerful tool for that.
Okay, that makes sense. But, how do they actually use it? When you think about insurance, there's so many factors involved.
You're right, there are. But that's the beauty of data, right? They gather massive amounts of information, driving records, accident rates, the likelihood of natural disasters in specific areas.
Wow, so they really factor in everything.
They even look at things like your age, your gender, even your credit score when assessing risk.
It's like they have a crystal ball or something.
Well, not quite a crystal ball, but pretty close.
But seriously, they take all that data, and then what?
They use it to calculate the probability of you, the individual, filing a claim. And that probability, it directly affects how much you pay for insurance, your premiums.
So, like, if you have a history of reckless driving, for example?
Exactly. Your probability of an accident goes up, and so do your insurance premiums.
And on the other hand, if you're a safe driver, you've got a clean record.
Then you're considered low risk, and your premiums will likely be lower. It all comes down to using data to assess the likelihood of those future events.
That's really interesting. It makes their pricing model seem less random, like more scientific somehow.
Absolutely. And it shows how understanding even the basics of probability can give you more power as a consumer.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, the textbook, it ended on a thought-provoking note about how probability plays a role in our everyday lives. And it got me thinking about how many times we face situations where if we understood a little bit more about probability, we might make different decisions, more informed decisions.
Oh, absolutely.
All the time. It really is all about, like you said, having that knowledge, right?
Yeah. Knowledge is power. The more you understand about probability, the better decisions you can make. Like, let's say you're trying to choose between different insurance plans.
Okay.
Happens to all of us, right? One plan, it might have a lower monthly payment, but then if something happens, you have to pay more out of pocket. And then another one's the opposite, right? Higher monthly, but then lower out of pocket.
Right.
So knowing a bit about probability, it helps you weigh the odds. Like, how likely are you to actually need to use the insurance? And then what are the potential costs? Right.
Yeah, because otherwise you're just kind of blindly picking, or you get scared off by the technical terms.
Exactly.
But if you understand a bit of the probability behind it, you can make a much more informed choice. Like, okay, this plan actually makes more sense for me.
Absolutely. It's like you can see through the fog and actually understand what's going on.
Yeah, totally. And it's not just insurance either, right? Like, what about investments?
Oh, for sure. Investments too. You can use probability to assess the risks and rewards, right? So you can make smarter choices that align with your own financial goals.
So I shouldn't just throw a dart at a board and hope for the best.
Probably not the best strategy.
Okay, noted. But seriously, it's amazing how something that sounds so theoretical actually ends up having a real impact on our everyday decisions.
It really does. And we've just scratched the surface here. Probability is a deep subject, right? There's theoretical probability, where you're thinking about these ideal scenarios.
Okay.
And then there's conditional probability, where you look at how one event can change the probability of another event happening.
Wow, so much to learn. Well, we may not have become probability experts today, but
It's definitely got a good foundation now.
Yeah, that's true. And hey, next time you see a weather forecast or even just a percentage chance of something happening, you'll know there's a whole world of probability at play behind it. Thanks for diving into this fascinating topic with us today. Probability, it's more relevant and more interesting than you might think.